Welcome to Thames Luminaries lecture series, a truly great collaboration to celebrate our local history and local luminaries, drawn together by the River Thames. My name is Rachel Morrison from Marble Hill, and I'll be the host for these lectures. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to our chair for the Thames Luminaries series. She's a lecturer, a literary historian, and she's Professor Judith Hawley.
Thank you, Rachel, for your introduction, and thank you for all the work you've done to make this series possible, and to others like Robert, who's been organising the ticketing. And we are just astounded by how much work Paul Robert has had to do, because we now have over 1,000 people subscribing to this series. So it's a delight for the 9 historic organisations who make up the Thames Luminaries to welcome you and to be able to connect with you and to realise just what a hunger there is for engagement with your local history, and with this, in particular, this theme of gardening, when the outdoor space is at such a premium in our current lockdown. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker for tonight. I'm delighted to welcome back, in fact, Dr. Marion Harney, who spoke to us last week about Alexander Pope's garden at Twickenham. Horace Walpole and Strawberry Hill, her subject tonight, were the subject of her PhD, later published as an award-winning book entitled Placemaking for the Imagination, Horace Walpole and Strawberry Hill. Her research is truly groundbreaking. She's the first to examine why Walpole, a self-styled arbiter of taste, chose the Gothic style for his villa when Palladianism was in the ascendancy. Tonight she's going to concentrate on the landscape, because the setting was a blank canvas upon which Walpole could inscribe an enchanted historicis commemorative garden. Over to you, Marion. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to those who listened to my first lecture on Pope's grotto and garden at Twickenham. And tonight I'm going to talk to you, as Judith said, about Strawberry Hill. The villa of Horace Walpole in Twickenham, acquired in 1747, started life in 1698 as a shapeless little box, chopped straw hall, which he renamed Strawberry Hill. Horace Walpole, 4th Earl of Orford, was the youngest son of the Whig politician Robert Walpole, 1st Earl of Orford, Member of Parliament for King's Lynn, Norfolk, and the first Prime Minister of Great Britain. A prominent figure of his age, Horace embraced a range of interests, wrote prolifically, recording his thoughts in extensive correspondence and other texts throughout most of the 18th century. A man of taste and letters, he was acquainted with many fields of study: antiquarianism, architecture, literature, and the sister arts of poetry, painting, and gardening. Following the death of his father, Walpole acquired the leasehold of this small 17th century house seen on the left here in Twickenham that was to evolve into the Gothic villa at Strawberry Hill. And you'll see the eventual building on the right. So the Roke map of 1746 depicts the house here, with a short formal avenue running southeast, some outbuildings to the southwest, and a kitchen garden to the south, but otherwise with little planting and virtually isolated on the edge of pastoral open country. This purchase was to be a pivotal point in Walpole's life. The creation of his seat at Strawberry Hill, which is essentially an autobiographical site, was to become the central passion of his life. While Walpole designed Strawberry Hill Villa with the aid of a committee made up of close friends, the landscape at Strawberry Hill is essentially a personal story. His statement in his History of the Modern Taste in Gardening, with its implied criticism of contemporary professional landscape designers, sets out his ethos. So he says, in general, it is probably true that the possessor, if he has any taste, must be the designer of his own improvements. He sees the situation in all seasons of the year, at all times of the day. He knows where beauty will not clash with convenience and observes in his silent walks and accidental rides 1,000 hints that might escape a person who, in a few days, sketches out a pretty picture, but had not the leisure to examine the details and relations of every part. So the landscape, like the Gothic villa, was designed to create the impression of an ancient site that had evolved, modified by accretions over time. Walpole had chided his friend Horace Mann in a letter regarding the mood and impression he wants to create in the garden. Walpole asks, "You say, you suppose my garden is to be Gothic too? That can't be. Gothic is merely architecture, and as one has a satisfaction in imprinting the gloom of abbeys and cathedrals on one's house, so one's garden, on the contrary, is to be nothing but riot and the gaiety of nature." So documentary evidence points to elements of the landscape being designed by Walpole as soon as he acquired the site of about 5 acres. His concept for the relationship of the house to its landscape took advantage of the natural topography and exploited its borrowed prospects. The house is situated on level ground with a slight slope to the northeast in the direction of the River Thames, and the natural topography allowed extensive views to the river and into the surrounding countryside across the landscape to the villages of Richmond, Twickenham and Kingston. Historically, water meadows separated the garden and ground from the Thames, and Walpole continually purchased land to the south and east to secure these views to the river and wider landscape, and gradually enlarged his holding from his original 5 acres to a total of 46, buying approximately 41 separate plots from 17 owners. He initially carried out a campaign of structural tree planting, commencing with the grove near the house, maintaining the paramount views of an open aspect to the river. He established sweeping lawns punctuated by groups of trees to break the uniformity, carrying out an extensive tree planting program, purchasing some 300 of mainly native species trees in the first 4 years in initial phase, to create this medieval grove to the south of the house. These were supplemented by others that he propagated in his own nursery, which he quickly established, probably on the site of the kitchen garden. This intense burst of activity in the beginning soon created the impression that the trees had existed long before he acquired the ancient site and had only recently been taken into the modern pleasure ground. The land beyond the boundary of the pleasure ground was also incorporated into his own designed landscape, effectively creating a small-scale estate garden. The only significant topographical works at this time was the construction of a 200-metre natural terrace to take full advantage of the river views and borrowed prospect into the surrounding countryside and the animated landscapes of Twickenham and Richmond, enlivened by passing traffic. Walpole wrote again to Mann in 1753, enclosing a site plan, unfortunately now lost. But however, this later estate plan of circa 1793 illustrates the completed garden. And I'm just going to move something to show you this. And it incorporates many of the features that Walpole mentions into the letter to Mann, and is useful, if somewhat misleading, in the detail for reconstructing the landscape. And so you see here, sorry, we've got something else. So here's the villa here, and this is the serpentine path going around the villa and the meadows down to the Thames, which we'll talk about in some detail. So he says to Mann, "The enclosed, enchanted little landscape then is Strawberry Hill. The view of the castle is what I have just finished, and is the only side that will be regular. Directly before it is an open grove through which you see a field which is bounded by a serpentine wood of all kind of trees and flowering shrubs and flowers. The lawn before the house is situated on the top of a small hill, from whence to the left you see the town and church of Twickenham, encircling a turn of the river that looks exactly like a seaport in miniature. The opposite shore is a most delicious meadow, bounded by Richmond Hill, which loses itself in the noble woods of the park to the end of the prospect on the right, whereas another turn of the river and the suburbs of Kingston, as luckily placed as Twickenham is on the left. And a natural terrace on the brow of my hill, with meadows of my own down to the river, commands both extremities. Is this not a tolerable prospect? You must figure that all of this is perpetually enlivened by a navigation of boats and barges, and by a road below my terrace, with coaches, post-chaises, wagons and horsemen constantly in motion, and the fields speckled with cows, horses and sheep. So the design of the villa and naturalistic landscape setting was one of the earliest picturesque ensembles in England, and in Walpole's time, Strawberry Hill received many visitors. The 18th century visitor would have first viewed the picturesque Gothic castle from the Hampton Court Road, which passed directly along the north facade of the house, seen in the last image. It was described by a visitor in the 18th century. The approach to the house through lofty trees, the embattled walls overgrown with ivy, the spiry pinnacles, the grave air of the building give it all the appearance of an old abbey. Visitors to Strawberry Hill would have then participated in a guided tour by the housekeeper or Walpole himself, if they were important enough, of the antiquarian contents of the interior, but that's a whole other lecture, and we're just going to concentrate on the garden. And finally, they would exit here through the great cloister, an open groin-vaulted outdoor room, which functioned as the connection between the interior and exterior. The visitor would meet the agreeable surprise occasioned by the expansive views of the sweeping great lawn, grove and serpentine wood. As we saw on the estate plan, Walpole created a series of distinct areas linking discrete but interrelated features by a serpentine path that wended its way around the southern and western extremities of the site, connecting the buildings to the furthermost features in the landscape. Walpole frequently refers to walking his circuit, suggesting that it was designed to be experienced in a particular sequence, and we will follow his route. Dense planting concealed each episode from the next and added the essential components of visual contrast in structure, texture, colour and form, providing intricacy, variety and surprise. The walk was conceived to create different atmospheric moods through a succession of spatial experiences, making a series of natural transitions from Gothic gloom formed by dark evergreens, after which the visitor would emerge into hanging woods, then into small clearings and intimate spaces lit by dappled sunlight penetrating the trees. The visitor had glimpses and alternating views of the landscape outside the garden, the villa, and diverse architectural features, structures, and planting as they progressed around the prescribed route. The disposition of objects and incidents added to the sense of theatre, which he appreciated for its poetical, metaphorical, and philosophical associations. The Gothic gate was the first medieval incident encountered on the circuit, with the pier design based on tomb architecture. The gate led into the serpentine walk from the Hampton Court Road, sending a visual signal to approaching visitors of the Gothic castle. It probably also served as a pedestrian entrance to the garden. The chapel in the woods came next in the sequence and sat somberly in the far southwest corner of the circuit, surrounded by larches and other melancholic planting to create a gloomy, reflective atmosphere. The chapel, seen on approaches from the north and east, was meant to represent an ancient building type, the oratory or private place of worship attached to a nobleman's house, castle, or monastery. And as I said, many of the architectural elements at Strawberry Hill were derived from tomb designs, and the chapel too had its origins in tomb architecture. This particular design derived from Bishop Audley's Chantry Chapel in Salisbury Cathedral. Other artifacts encountered on the circuit included a large antique sarcophagus in marble with bas-reliefs, and this too would have been situated among gloomy, melancholy planting appropriate to and associated with tombs and burial, including elms and evergreen trees and shrubs such as cypress, laurel, pine, bay, yew, all, he says, exceedingly solemn and venerable. The next episode was the oak shell bench designed by Bentley and based on Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which was oriented to the River Thames and surrounding landscape, with another Gothic gate nearby. I propose that it was erected in remembrance of Walpole's mother, who had a celebrated grotto overlooking the Thames in her garden at Orford House, Chelsea, where Horace was born and where she died. The shell bench, with its asymmetrical rococo motifs and scrollwork that recall the shell-adorned grotto at Chelsea, were carefully placed among the roots of an oak to appear as if it was the product of the tree and make the association of Venus seeking refuge in woodland. The rose, myrtle, apple and lime trees are symbols traditionally associated with the goddess and accompanying depictions of Venus, and therefore Walpole would have set the shell bench within this horticultural context. After experiencing a series of contrasting scenes, moods and episodes, associative incidents and character areas, all with, again, this increasing sense of theatre, the visitor eventually emerges into the dramatic expanse of the lawn and the atmospheric open grove, where the walk terminated and where perspective views of the villa provided the closing sequence. The lawn was a sweeping expanse of grass with no planting indicated in any of the illustrative material. He did, however, place some potted plants towards the grove, and there is evidence of specimen trees standing forward of the tree belt, thus loosening the edges in the manner of William Kent. The grove near the house was a grid-like tree plantation of varying depth, separating the open ground with views through the trunks and no laurel lawn or understory evident to restrict the sight to the river. A grove has ancient connotation, and Walpole's formal grove near the house was intersected by straight paths through the trees. He also planted loosely configured groves of oak, lime, elm and walnut, and the serpentine wood had a mixture of deciduous and evergreen trees, including laurel and various flowering shrubs around the south and west perimeters. The structural planting established the groves, created woodland boundaries, framed particular views and screened unwanted views in and out of the villa and the landscape. In addition, Walpole created a gap by cutting an avenue through the trees to allow long views and give the appearance of the ancient grove incorporated into the landscape in the modern taste. And although there was no planting apparent beneath the trees, mistletoe and scented climbers were placed at their base in order to ascend through the branches and hang down in festoons, providing scent and colour, which combine, as he says, to heighten the pleasures of the imagination. Mr. Ashe, a nurseryman in Twickenham, had supplied Pope with plants, and while Walpole had requested that his tree planting was carried out in an irregular manner, he replied, "Yes, sir, I understand. You would have them hang down somewhat poetical." Walpole consciously rejected strict formality, but the polite, symmetrical garden facade of the villa was more ordered and the planting regular, in contrast to other areas of the garden. Much of the illustrative material commissioned by Walpole shows plants in pots and tubs close to the south and east facades of the house, suggesting they were a regular feature in these positions. They undoubtedly contain perfume plants such as orange trees, as Walpole was very fond of their evocative scent, recording that the perfume of flowers is more evocative than colour. He says, "Even my passion for flowers lies chiefly in my nose. I care much more for their odours than for their hues or for the anatomy of their pistils." There are also climbers scaling the walls. Lime trees planted close to the building, the scene here, were a key feature of the east elevation and are apparent in numerous images. They provide a more filtered light, enhancing the atmosphere of gloomth with colour and animation to the interior, but limned up to ensure that the views out to the river were not obscured by foliage. There was also a graduated shrubbery extending to the northeast of the house, principally to screen the Hampton Court Road, which is depicted in later views with trellis work, as seen here, and pots in front of the shrubbery as it became overgrown as it reached maturity. Walpole was always interested in the effects that could be obtained with planting, and he describes how painterly principles could be applied to achieve picturesque compositions. So he says, "Above all cypresses, which I think are my chief passion, there is nothing so picturesque when they stand 2 or 3 in a clump upon a little hillock or rising above low shrubs, and particularly near buildings. There is another bit of picture of which I am fond, and that is a larch or a spruce fir planted behind a weeping willow and shooting upwards as the willow depends. I think for courts about a house or winter gardens, almond trees mixed with evergreens, particularly with Scots firs, have a pretty effect." He also frequently mentions sensuous and sensory stimulation derived from the visual display, colour, texture and forms, and how the fragrance of plants is particularly evocative. He describes the feeling engendered by experiencing this colour and inhaling the scents of lilac, jasmine and orange, and their capacity for triggering his imagination. "I am just come in from the garden in the most oriental of all evenings, and from breathing odours beyond those of Araby. The acacias, which the Arabians have the sense to worship, are covered with blossoms. The honeysuckles dangle from every tree in festoons. The syringas are thickets of sweets, and the new cut hay of the field in the garden tempers the balmy gales with simple freshness. The pleasure of lilac, jonquil and hyacinth season is frequently mentioned in his correspondence as one of his chief passions." So, having recorded in 1753 in Walpole's Letter to Man his reaction and delight at acquiring and designing the enchanted little landscape, we will now allow him the last word when we witness the importance of the building, its landscape setting, and their ability to instill the pleasures of the imagination some 30 years later. So Walpole says, "There is a solemnity in the house of which the cuts will give you an idea," meaning engravings. "They cannot add the gay variety of the scene without, which is very different from every side, and almost from every chamber, and makes a most agreeable contrast. The house being placed almost in an elbow of the Thames, which surrounds half and consequently beautifies three of the aspects. Then my little hill, and diminutive enough it is, gazes up to Royal Richmond, and Twickenham on the left and Kingston Wick on the right are seen across bends of the river, which on each hand appears like a Lilliputian seaport. Swans, cows, sheep, coaches, post-chaises, carts, horsemen and foot passengers are continually in view. The fourth scene is a large common field, a constant prospect of harvest in its stages, traversed under my windows by the great road to Hampton Court. In short, an animated view of the country. These moving pictures compensate the conventional gloom of the inside, which, however, when the sun shines, is gorgeous as he appears all crimson and gold and azure through the painted glass. Now, to be quite fair, you must turn the perspective and look at the vision through the diminishing end of the telescope, for nothing is so small as the whole, and even Mount Richmond would not reach up to Fiesole's shoe buckle. So this lecture, I hope, has identified the garden at Strawberry Hill's significance in the context of English landscape history, registering a change from the classical emblematic garden as we saw in Pope's garden to an expressive natural landscape that stimulates the imagination both by intellectual and sensory means, a concept that substantially predates the romantic sensibility of nature. Evolving over a period of 50 years, the garden was Walpole's personal expression, and it reflected the ethos he laid down in the history, that the possessor, if he has any taste, must be the designer of his own improvements, and it remained the vision of one man. Thank you.